Shri Amitabh Kant.
Ladies and gentlemen, a very good morning to all of you. I hope all of you are enjoying your stay in this lovely new hotel, the Leela Hotel. It's a new hotel, so you'll have some teething issues, but I think they'll get sorted out as we go along. But this being the first conference here, I think it'll bring in a lot of good luck to this management of this hotel. So ladies and gentlemen, let me just speak, and let me just speak from my heart rather than use any slides or any PowerPoint, because I've over the years, having worked in tourism, realized that PowerPoints are a very, very slow way to poison people to death. And therefore, let me just speak and then interact with some of you. And you know, we must understand that we are living in a world which is essentially becoming an urban century. This is an urban century because UN has forecasted that by 2030, 70% of the world will be living in urban cities. And actually, if you were to look at India, by 2030, 350 million Indians would be moving, an additional 350 million Indians would be moving to urban areas. And by 2050, McKinsey's latest study shows that 700 million Indians would move to urban cities. And therefore, a leading thinker, a very leading thinker of our time, C.K. Prahalad, who was a professor, the late C.K. Prahalad, said actually that India needs to create 500 new cities by the time it becomes 75 in 2022. And if it is not able to create new urban centers and new urban cities, actually every existing city will become a slum. And therefore, his view was that the biggest challenge India faces is the challenge of urbanization. And in reality, every minute in India, 30 Indians move from rural areas to urban areas. You know, the challenge for India is to actually continue to grow at rates of 8 to 9 to 10% per annum over a long period of time, over 3 to 4 decades, to be able to lift a very vast segment of our population above the poverty line. But if you were to look at the composition of India's GDP, almost 52% of India's GDP comes from the services sector. Whereas if you were to compare this with other countries, in the case of China, about close to 40%, Korea about 32%, Japan about 35%, comes from the manufacturing sector. And actually, if you were to look back, most of these countries have been driven by their manufacturing sector. And actually, manufacturing sector creates vast number of jobs. So, around mid-70s, 73, 74, we were at the same level of growth as China. And, you know, the Chinese revolution, the peasantry movement, was led by the peasantry movement. And therefore, much like India, you know, India has had this big obsession that, based on the founding fathers' belief, Mahatma Gandhi's belief, that villages will be economically self-sufficient, and therefore they'll be commercially viable, and each village will be viable. And therefore, the Chinese philosophy was very much similar to this, because China's revolution was also peasantry-led, and therefore they also believed this. But in 70s, China broke away from it. China broke away radically, ruthlessly, in a very revolutionary manner, and they said, we're going to drive manufacturing. And when they said that we'll drive manufacturing, a logical consequence of that was that workers moved to urban areas. Workers moved, their families moved, young children moved. And the spatial manifestation of that manufacturing process was urbanization. So if you go to a place like Shenzhen, one single company called Foxconn actually employs, which does the assembly for Apple pads and Apple phone, actually employs 630,000 workers on one site in China. 630,000 workers on one site. So that was the scale of manufacturing. And today's world, it's all about size, it's all about scale, the scale of manufacturing. As India has to grow at those rates of 8 to 9%, let me tell you, historically, if you look back, no country in the world post-World War II has ever grown on the back of agriculture. Give me one example of any country which has grown on the back of agriculture. No. Whether it was Japan post-World War II, whether it was Korea, whether it was China, Taiwan, Singapore, all have grown on the back of manufacturing. And therefore, over a long period of time, if you want to sustain this growth over a period of time, services, yes. But manufacturing in India has to play a very critical and a very significant role. So starting 70s, 73 onwards, China grew at rates of 10% per annum year after year after year. So if you grow at 10%, actually the compounding power of growth is so enormous that you double your GDP in 7 years' time. And therefore, China continued to double its GDP every 7 years since then. And therefore, if we on the contrary, as a very vibrant young democracy, we grew at rates of 5% for the first decade, 6% for another decade, then we grew haltingly at about 7%, and probably we'll go back to 5.5 or 6% growth. But the point is that if China is 1,600, we are 800, and therefore we have to pursue, to my mind, if you need to create jobs for a vast segment of population, single-minded pursuit to growth. And if you have growth, you'll create jobs. And if you create jobs, you'll alleviate poverty. And therefore, to my mind, these are very necessary and significant issues on which we must debate and discuss. Now, while manufacturing is necessary, a logical consequence of manufacturing is the process of urbanization. And actually, my view on this is that actually in the next 4 decades, India is going to build so much. India is actually going to build new cities, it's going to build overbridges, it's going to build airports, it's going to build new metros, that it will actually in the next 4 decades create and build a completely new India. And what we are going to do in the next 4 decades, we'll be actually building more and creating more than what we've done in the last 500 years. And therefore, it's very necessary that we follow a very different strategy of building, and we follow a very different strategy of creation than what has been pursued in the Western world. If we were to pursue, if India and China were to pursue the strategy of development and creation and building exactly the model of the Western world, we will need 4 planet Earth to do that. 4 planet Earth to do that, but alas, we have 1 planet Earth. And therefore, you need a very innovative, you need a very creative, and you need a very sustainable strategy of growth. When new cities were created across America or Europe, land, gas, and water were all cheaply available. They were all cheaply available in abundant quantity. And therefore, America created sprawling cities. It created sprawling cities. You could live in New Jersey, you travel to Manhattan, 2.5 hours away. You have big cars. These are gas guzzlers. Gas was cheaply available. And therefore, because gas and water were all cheaply available, you created verticals, you created big verticals. Verticals of power, verticals of water, verticals of transportation. And actually, in reality, those cities were created for cars and not for people. They were created for cars because the American car companies actually bought over the railway companies. America had a very flourishing railways, but the car companies, the General Motors and the Fords, bought over these railway companies and destroyed the railway companies so that cars could be bought. And actually, America created cities for cars. And let us look at the example of two cities created at the same point of time in history. The example of Atlanta and the example of Barcelona in Europe. They made at the same point of time in history. They cater to roughly the same population, 2.2 million. The CO2 emission in Atlanta is 12 times more than what it is in Barcelona. Simply because 97% of the people in Atlanta travel by cars. 97% of the people travel by car, whereas in Barcelona, 65% of the people travel by public transport. They use the metro, they use the public transportation system, and another 18% of the people either cycle or walk. And therefore, Barcelona's CO2 emission is 12 times less. But if you were to reverse the process of planning, and if today you were to say that you want about 70% of the people in Atlanta to cycle or walk or use public transportation, you will have to virtually destroy Atlanta and rebuild all over again. And you will have to create 4,686 new metro stations to create a new Atlanta with low CO2 emissions. And therefore, Atlanta can't do this, America can't do this because of fiscal imbalances. And therefore, the process of building, destroying, and rebuilding is just not feasible in today's world. And to my mind, therefore, planning and design holds the key to the success of India in the next 4 decades. And what we do today and how we plan, how we program, how we projectize, how we design, holds the key to India's success in the future and how we are, and this in reality will enable how we do this, how we plan, how we design, how we engineer, will hold the key to India's prosperity for the next 4 decades. And therefore, ladies and gentlemen, to my mind, the most important thing for India is to plan, program, projectize, and design. Now, India has been a very reluctant urbanizer. India has been a very reluctant urbanizer, largely, as I said, because of our founding fathers' belief. But it is a movement which is inevitable. And it is inevitable because people, many of you can go back to your villages and check up, and people living in those villages, like I do once in a while, the dream of every Indian living in a village is actually to move to an urban area. And they will move. They will move because cities are centers of growth. Cities are centers of innovation. Cities are centers of creativity. And actually, because cities, actually, while they occupy just 3% of the Earth's space, they produce 70% of the GDP in the world. But while they produce 70%, they account for about 70% of the GDP of the Earth, they consume almost 70% of the Earth's resources, and they also account for 2/3 of the CO2 emissions in the world. And therefore, while cities are centers of growth, they are the most polluting centers in the world. And therefore, the movement towards urbanization, the movement towards cities is inevitable. But what is not inevitable is our ability to bring in sustainability, to control the CO2 emissions, our ability to build cities of the future which are sustainable and which hold a model for the rest of the world. And therefore, ladies and gentlemen, to my mind, the process of urbanization, the process of infrastructure creation in America has come to an end. The process of urbanization and infrastructure has come to an end in Europe. The process of infrastructure and urbanization has almost come to an end in China, or is virtually coming to an end in China. But we are at the beginning of this process in India. In India, we are about to unleash our energy to create a completely new India and build a new India in the next 4 decades. And therefore, it's very important that we build this very sustainable India. And when we do this, it's very important that we spend time on planning and design. One of the key projects which we are doing is the Delhi-Mumbai Industrial Corridor. Now, at present, all goods produced in the northern part of India, as all the northern states of India, actually move by lorries or they move by passenger trains. And they pass through 6 states of India and reach the ports for exports, and it takes them about 14 to 15 days. So while in the rest of the world, 70% of the goods for exports move by trains, by container trains in India, 70% of the goods moved by road, by lorries, and therefore the CO2 pollution and the NOx emissions are very high in India because everything moves by road. They don't move by trains at all, 70% of the goods. And it's a very lopsided thing. But what will happen in 2017 is that there will be a dedicated freight corridor which will connect Delhi to the ports on the western coast of India, JNPT and Gujarat ports, the private ports in Gujarat. And from 14 days, it will put goods from the northern part of India into the ports within 12 hours. Within 12 hours. Now this, to my mind, is a revolutionary change. This is radical in many ways. So 1,483 square kilometer from Dadri close to Delhi to the JNPT port in 12 hours by container trains running at high speed, double stacking, triple stacking, just carrying containers. And they will put them into the ports on the western coast of India. So high speed, it radically reduces your logistic costs. It puts goods into the ports of India. Now, India needs to do 2 things. One, it needs to improve efficiency into your port management, and it needs to create many more ports. But what it really does is that it opens up a completely new part of India. So there's a western corridor linking Delhi to Mumbai, and there's an eastern corridor. And the eastern corridor will actually connect Calcutta to Ludhiana in the north. And both of them will meet at Dadri in UP. But these are very revolutionary changes. By 2017, you will have revolutionary changes. And what it does is, on the western coast, it opens a completely new part of India. It opens a new route of India from passing through 6 states of India